Watauga County, a unique place. Mountaintops, quiet valleys, 4 seasons of activities, a diverse and vibrant economy, a major state university. But let's walk back in time to a time when the entire population of the county was less than the incoming freshman class at ASU, as we discover places and see faces in Watauga County's history.
We don't exactly know where the term Watauga comes from. If you read local literature, it says that it's a Cherokee word and it means, beautiful waters. And that looks so great on our tourist brochures. It's probably a Creek word and probably means broken waters. It was a word that the Cherokee kind of adopted into their own language. But as far as exactly being able to pinpoint some source and say this is what it means, we don't have that available to us.
Let's just say there are many variations on how meat camp became meat camp.
Meat camp, there are 2 or 3 different stories about how meat camp got its name. One of those stories is because there was an abundance of deer and bear and turkey and maybe even elk at that point in time. Just an abundance of meat in that general area. Another local story is that the hunters would come up into that area and they would go in the surrounding countryside and they would hunt and they would bring all of their meat back to that general spot where they had a camp and they would start preserving it before they would transport it off the mountain.
Meat camp. Meat camp is a great name in this county because I'm not even sure it was originally called meat camp. The story is that it was a kind of communal gathering place to store meat. That story doesn't fly really well. It could have been a smokehouse that was used out there for smoking meat that was brought back later on. I know in my research I found that meat camp was probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, settled areas in the county. There are references in 1760s deeds to earlier cabins. They probably go back into the late 1750s there. Unfortunately, those records are gone.
They talk about meat camp, of course, and I've heard different stories about it. One thing I have heard is that actually there used to be a somewhat of a settlement in there, and that they thought it was really called Neat Camp, which neat is a beef, and they killed beef there. Then I've heard that Daniel Boone liked to hunt there, and he called it Meat Camp because it was just covered up with bears. And then I've heard the story of having a little cabin there, and a hunter would come along and he'd have something to eat, and he'd hunt something else and leave it in the cabin for the next guy to come and eat. So that's a story of meat camp.
So I have a different story for the reason that it's named meat camp, and it goes against the other stories that are predominantly told for this area. But because I have Cherokee ancestry, one of the stories that I was told was that meat camp was given its name because this area was hunting ground for the Cherokee, and they would actually store meat in meat camp for the next group that would come in behind them and get it and bring it back to their home. So that's a different take, and that's just one of those stories that goes in with the other handful of stories that we're probably never really going to know the real meaning of.
The meat camp area is also situated on the old Buffalo Trail. Yes, where the buffalo roam, or where they used to roam. The eastern woodlands bison did indeed exist. It was rare by 1800 and extinct by 1820. Way past meat camp is a place called Pottertown, or Tamarack. 100 years ago, it was a place where men would go to drop out of society. It's sort of a self-imposed witness protection program, especially if your last name was Potter.
There are some neat place names in Watauga County, and there are some places that the names aren't unusual, but anybody that grew up here has certain connotations connected with that name. My favorite from high school is Pottertown. You didn't go up in Pottertown after dark. You didn't go up in Pottertown during the day unless you were with somebody from Pottertown or you had a specific name of a person you were going to see and could tell them, I am going to see this person. It was a rough area, and not just the Potters, that's the name that it had, but it was, I guess in a sense you could say it was to the rest of the area what the mountains were to the rest of the colony in 1780. It was out on the fringe, it was a little bit rougher, and they made their own rules. It's certainly not that way today. That's something that's changed now. But it was one of those communities that the impression was you stayed away from there. Now, was that true or not? I don't know. I stayed away from there.
A lot of great place names and places in this area. Boone is a great place to start.
From what I have read in some journals, Spandenberg wrote in his journal, that the whole valley of Boone was just a grassland, because it being a hunting ground for the Catawba and the Cherokee and stuff, that they actually did land management then and would burn off the place so the game would come in, plenty of grass to eat, and they didn't have to wander as far to hunt. So Daniel Boone probably stood on the hill right where we're at and looked down this valley, and he may have saw herds of buffalo then. It's hard to say because that was like, 1752, 1755, somewhere in there.
It's important to remember that Boone was not called Boone during the time that Daniel Boone was hunting here. That name would not be attached to this small mountain valley for many, many years.
Back in the 1830s, there was a community there, village called Council's Store. It was named for the Council's family. In 1849, Watauga County is created, and they decide to name the county seat Boone, and Council's Store becomes the Boone community. It, of course, is named for Daniel Boone, legendary hunter and explorer, our first tourist, who came up here from off the mountain to hunt and to fish and to stay with somebody else, like Benjamin Howard in his cabin there.
And then you got Howard's Knob, that was supposed to be named after Benjamin Howard, who was a loyalist and was hiding out in supposedly a cave up on Howard's Knob to keep from being hung. And his main place was down in Wilkes, and he would send his cattle up here to graze in the summertime because of the good grass and stuff. But he hung out, hiding out in the mountain, and then later on, towards the end of the war, he changed from loyalist to patriot because he knew he was going to lose everything he had or be hung. So that's how Howard's Knob came about. And I've heard stories about, they've said that, the little cabin over here they called Daniel Boone's cabin on River Street, where the marker is, that was actually Benjamin Howard's cabin. But that since they named the mountain after him, they were going to name the cabin after Boone. But Boone supposedly stayed in the cabin. It's supposed to be like a herder's cabin. And Benjamin Howard sent his slave up to take care of his cattle, and Boone would come with him to hunt.
How did Aho become Aho? Was it named for the Aho branch or creek that runs nearby? Which makes me think, what do other people call a branch? A race, a spring, a brook? But none of that solves the mystery of how Aho became Aho.
The story I have heard of Aho is that I cannot remember the names of the two gentlemen that own land in that area, but they were going to develop it and couldn't come up with a name. And they were sitting on the porch and said, well, let's just be quiet. And the next word that either one of us says is the name of our community. So they sat and they sat and they sat, and finally one of them yawned. Oh. And it became Aho. I do not know that this is a real story, but I like it.
Brian Fannon's story may or may not be true, but it is interesting that Michael Hardy also tells a very similar story with only a few minor differences.
They were trying to get the name of a new post office over in what we now call Aho, the Aho community. They were trying to get the name of a post office, and so they could not come up with a name at all for that community. As the local story goes, somebody had said, well, the next word somebody says will be the name of this community. And Daughtry leaned back in his chair and put his hands behind his head and said, Aho! And that's the name of the Aho community. That's how it got its name.
The gazettes and almanacs from 100 plus years ago would often use a community like Aho and give the distance to a point of interest, like Washington, D.C. And with a nod to those gazettes and almanacs of yore, the distance between Aho and the White House, for example, is 314 miles. And if you're traveling by horse and buggy at 3.2 miles an hour, that's 13 days, nearly a fortnight. The community of Vilas is located where 194 meets 421 and 321, just outside of Boone. How the community got its name is an interesting story that Terry Harmon tells, and it's not what you might think.
A lot of our place names in the county have a history that sometimes we've forgotten or maybe even never knew. I lived in Vilas all my life and never knew why Vilas was called Vilas. So recently I started doing a little research, and I read one line in John Preston Arthur's History of Watauga County that sort of got me on this trail. And he mentioned that that community had been called Vilas since the time of President Cleveland's first Postmaster General. So I thought, well, what does that have to do with that? Did the Postmaster General name it, or how did that come into being? So first of all, I started looking to see who the first Postmaster General was in Cleveland's administration, and lo and behold, his name was William Freeman Vilas. And so he was the namesake. He was the person that our post office and our community became named for. And it's kind of unusual because when you read about Vilas's life, he was a Union soldier, which is kind of odd for a southern state maybe to pick that as their namesake. But he was also Secretary of the Interior under Cleveland at one point. He was a U.S. Senator representing the state of Wisconsin. And I did find out that they had a Vilas County, Wisconsin, that was named for him. But still, it was a bit unusual. But as I looked back through the naming of other post offices in that era, there was even one named the Grover Cleveland Post Office. So it really wasn't all that unusual to name post offices after public officials.
Sugar Grove is named for the abundance of maple trees that grow in the area. The community was founded in 1837, and I think it's a little bit late right now to get any maple syrup because the sap's already run in March, but now I'm hungry for more pancakes. Watauga County's first Civil War trail marker is located in Sugar Grove at Cove Creek School. It commemorates Camp Mast, which was built near here as a fort for the Home Guard during the Civil War. We're now in Zionville in Watauga County, and the root word Zion was often synonymous with Jerusalem and the mountain near Jerusalem, Mount Zion. And here in Watauga County, it's not a stretch to consider the similarities between Mount Zion, the mountain, and this surrounding community. Zionville is also where the old Buffalo Trail and Daniel Boone Trail intersect near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. Something else happened around here as well. In 1866, a man stopped by the home of Colonel Grayson to work on his farm for just a few days to earn some money to buy a new pair of boots before continuing on west. That man, his name was Tom Dooley. You might know him better as Tom Dooley. The posse from Wilkes County caught up with him before he got to Mountain City. They found him near a creek. He was soothing his feet in the creek from the blisters worn by that new pair of boots. Dooley was eventually hanged after his second trial for the murder of Laura Foster. Tom Dooley's story would go on to become the basis for a song that was made famous by the Kingston Trio. One of the first versions of it, however, was sung by Ashe County's G.B. Grayson and Henry Witter in 1929. You might not be able to tell it, but Tater Hill is up there somewhere, shrouded in the clouds. And just to set the record straight, Tater Hill has never been called Potato Hill. You say potato, but I say tater. Valle Crucis. Did you catch I was speaking Latin right there? Because Valle Crucis is Latin for Vale of the Cross. It's a reference to where three streams converge here in the valley to form an image that's similar to a cross.
Well, the Native Americans stayed a lot in this area, but one of the big digs, of course, is Valle Crucis. And, of course, it had different names, too. Valley of the Cross.
Valle Crucis is another favorite name up here. That's one way that we tell people who are from here from people who are not from here. If you're from here, it's Valle Crucis. If you're not from here, it tends to be Valle Crucis. And I've heard that for as long as I can remember, and you go, oh, they're not from here. Valley of the Cross. And that name was applied in the 1800s. Actually, before that, it was known as the Valley of the Tiger. Bishop Asbury mentions in the 1790s coming through in May, I believe, and it was deserted. There had been a late frost that killed the corn crop, and the farmers knew that they could not get another corn crop in before frost in the fall. And if they couldn't do that, they wouldn't survive. So they had all moved out of the mountains to live with relatives and to squat and settle other places for the year, and they would come back the next year and plant their corn crop. So it has a kind of a neat history to it as well.
There was only a scattered settlement here in Valle Crucis until the early 1940s, and then Episcopal missionary Levi Ives showed up and founded Easter Chapel. By 1844, he had bought 2,000 acres with his own money, constructed a sawmill, and was working on mission buildings. But he got a different call, a call to join the Catholic Church, and so he did, and he sold all his land, but the mission remained. In 1926, the current church, Holy Cross, was built. Its architecture was based on a monastery in Wales, Great Britain. While Watauga County has an amazing cast of interesting characters from over the years, one that sticks out is Moses Cone, the King of Denham, who built an incredible estate on what is now the Blue Ridge Parkway. Moses Cone first came to Blowing Rock in the early 1870s with his father. It was then that he stated, like Thoreau in Walden Pond, that he wanted to go to the forest, go to the woods, and live deliberately, to live with intention, in the 13,000 square foot house with 20 plus rooms. And just to be fair, I think that Cone skews a bit more towards George Vanderbilt than he does to Henry David Thoreau. One of Cone's particular loves was engineering roads. In fact, there are 35 miles of carriage trails on the estate. And as the story goes, Cone would assemble a crew early in the morning, and they would follow him through the woods, planting stakes behind him. Later, they would go back and build those carriage roads by hand. Mrs. Cone liked using those carriage trails as well, and she used to trade visits back and forth with the lady who owned Chatola. But they had a falling out. Next time you're at Bass Lake, look for a wall that separates the boundary between the two estates. Not surprisingly, it's called Spite Wall. Blowing Rock was, and maybe still is, home to the rich and famous. And one of Cone's next-door neighbors were the heirs of Samuel Colt, yes, of Colt 45 fame. And these Colts were kind of wild. They had a still out in the woods, and they would host these wild soirees. That's right, hard liquor and handguns, not a great combo. In fact, one of the younger Colts got shot in the head during one of these wild parties. Cone, who was a pillar of Blowing Rock society, didn't look too kindly upon all the shenanigans going on next door, and he politely invited them to relocate, and they did. Moses Cone died young. He was only 51 years old. His wife Bertha lived an additional 39 years. They didn't have any kids, so eventually the property and 3,500 acres of prime Blowing Rock real estate passed to the National Park Service, and it's one of North Carolina's top tourist attractions, drawing over 200,000 visitors per year. And it doesn't hurt that it's located right off the parkway. Shulls Mill got its start in 1835 when Philip Shull, who was the grandson of a German immigrant who moved here in the 1770s, opened up a grist mill near his farm. Years later, Shulls Mill became a town. In fact, it was a big town. It rivaled Boone at the time. In 1915, it had 1,000 residents. It had 3 or 4 hotels. The county's first electric movie theater, Tweetsie Railroad, ran right through it. And did I mention it had a giant sawmill? Just imagine in this field, the virgin chestnut, oak, and poplar stacked stories high, ready to be milled, put on Tweetsie Railroad, and sent to the northeast. Seven Devils. The town that we know today was just an isolated farm, stuck up here between Hanging Rock and Grandfather, growing cabbage and tobacco down in the fertile soil in the valley, and running cattle up in the hills. In 1964, 7 men on horseback ambled up an old wagon trail to these peaks, and when they got here and saw this magnificent setting, they said to themselves, This is a good spot for a resort town. So, were these guys devilish? At the time, there was a rumor of an old man who had 7 sons up on the mountain who were as mean as the devil. And the locals said that during the winter, it was as windy as the devil up here. The investors noted the repeated occurrence of the number 7 and the perhaps coincidental occurrence of devilish kinds of things, and they wanted a catchy name for their town, so Seven Devils was born. Seven Devils is now home to Hawk's Nest Zipline and Snow Tubing Resort, which are heavenly. We're now next to Mystery Hill on Highway 321 just south of Boone, and it may be a mystery to some, but this house was built for Dee Dee and Lily Dougherty. Dougherty and his brother Blanford Barnard, or B.B. Dougherty, founded what became Appalachian State University. What the Dougherty started in 1899 was the Watauga Academy. In its first year, it had 3 grades and 53 students. D.D. bought the food, ran the school farm, took care of the physical plant, did the payroll. B.B. was the president or chancellor for over 50 years. Today, Appalachian State University has 16,000 plus students and is a part of the University of North Carolina system. I don't think B.B. or D.D. could have ever imagined it. Deep Gap, no huge mystery here, but what makes Deep Gap interesting are the people who traveled around it and the people who lived there. Daniel Boone spent quite a bit of his life in and around the Deep Gap area, traveling to Boone and points beyond from his home in the Yadkin River Valley. Deep Gap was also the home of Arthel Watson. You might know him better as Doc. Doc Watson played what he called traditional plus, traditional Appalachian mountain music, plus whatever other style he was interested in playing during that night's performance.
So many of our communities here are named for people, like the Romanger family and the Romanger community. Perkinsville, just east of downtown Boone, is named actually for a man who came from Kentucky whose last name was Perkins. He was a Confederate veteran. And different areas, and some of them are just purely geological, like Deep Gap. There's a great little community in Watauga County called Goo Goo. It's over kind of beyond Valle Crucis toward the Romanger community. And as the local story goes, it's called Goo Goo because of the creek that runs through the area. It's not a rocky creek like a lot of our streams in this area are, but it's full of goo. And people would go down there and they would get stuck in the goo, and so the name stuck, the Goo Goo Community.
We hope you've enjoyed our trip back in time as we've visited places and seen faces connected to Watauga County's history. The truth is, we've just scratched the surface of Watauga's heritage, and we invite you to learn more about Watauga County history and keep it alive and well for future generations.